I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 43 of EO Radio Show. This is the third in a series of quick tip episodes focusing on the details of state registration of nonprofit corporations. In episode 38, we talked about filing in Delaware and California, which are the most frequently used by our clients, most of whom have a connection with California. Episode 40 focused on the state filings in Nevada and Arizona. Today, with the help of Joe Hilliard again, we will talk about the basic state filing requirements for nonprofit corporations operating in Washington State and Oregon. We'll work our way through the rest of the states in future episodes. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. As we discussed in previous episodes, nonprofit corporations are one variety of fictitious business entities. Others include partnerships and limited liability companies. The laws of all the states prescribe certain formalities that organizers of these business entities must go through so that the entity can be regulated and subject to the legal process as a person. Since business enterprises aren't natural persons, the laws have developed mechanisms for treating them like natural people. This is where the state filings come into play. In order for the organizers of these fictitious entities to take advantage of the protection of the state laws, they have to provide notice as to legal name, the state whose jurisdiction they are claiming for corporate organization laws, a physical address where they can be served with legal process, and certain other information. In this episode, we aren't going to dive deep into the pros and cons for where to incorporate, nor whether to incorporate at all. Sometimes a different form is better, such as an LLC or a trust. But instead, in this episode, we're focusing on features like the ease of formation, standardized documents that are available, filing fees, and similar matters in today's states, which are Washington and Oregon. For this topic, I'm really happy to welcome back Joe Hilliard. Joe is a senior paralegal at Farella, Braun & Martel. He specializes in formation and compliance matters for all manner of entities. And in particular, he helps me with charities that are tax exempt under Internal Revenue Code 501c3 and other exemption categories. Prior to working at Farella, Joe worked in-house for several real estate development and management companies in Southern California, working on real estate purchases and vendor contracting. He also worked for the law firm Morrison & Foerster in their intellectual property litigation group. Welcome back to the show, Joe. Thanks for joining me again. So today our states are Washington and Oregon. Let's start with Washington. Can you talk a little bit about when an organization would want to organize its nonprofit under the laws of Washington, or if they're not organized there, when they need to qualify to do business and go through these mechanics? Talk about that a little bit.
As with all the states we have discussed, if you do business in Washington as a nonprofit, you will need to have a legal presence and or be registered in Washington. This goes back to even if we formed in Delaware or in California, you need to have a legal presence when you're doing actual charitable work or donations in Washington. As a specific instance, if land is gifted to a nonprofit that is based in California, but the land is actually in Washington, and you're taking ownership via deed, you need to register in Washington to get the charitable benefits of the state. Otherwise, you will be taxed as a normal corporation owning that land. So it behooves you to register in Washington.
Exactly. This also goes to the point of taking advantage of the benefit of the laws in a state. For a corporate entity, if you're not registered in the state where you've got property, you can't defend yourself in court or take advantage of the other laws. So once you receive assets in another state, that's a pretty good trigger. And like you said, we've recently seen this where a charity's given real property in another state. And even if they're not going to hold on to it for very long, you still need to be registered there. So once you decide you need to be either formed in Washington or registered there if you're already incorporated somewhere else, talk a little bit about Washington's process and what their form articles of incorporation look like.
For sure. State has a form articles of incorporation for their domestic formations. Unlike our discussions of California, their fill-in form is actually very robust with a specific section for purpose of the corporation and any other provisions that you would like to have added that are germane to the nonprofit. It's not an actual addendum like we saw in California, which causes you to do a lot of extra work and then you don't even use the form. Their form is actually very user-friendly. As with Nevada, you also need to have the appointed resident agent sign the articles on this initial filing. And this is very much unique to Washington. You will be assigned what they call a UBI, a Unified Business Identifier. Unlike California, where the Secretary of State will assign you a corporation number and the Attorney General will give you a different number for your charitable organization, the 9-digit UBI will follow your nonprofit to other state agencies. It will go to your Department of Revenue, to the Department of Labor and Industries, and to the Employment Security Department. All of these, which makes it a lot easier for filing. It's like having a social security number specific to the state. It follows you everywhere. You don't have different numbers for different agencies. And in Washington, really talks to itself and interdepartment much more so than a lot of other states. Again, going back to California, where it's left hand, right hand never knows. Here, you have a real system of connection. And we've seen that where we do have ones registered in Washington, where this number makes it easy. They've really swapped things out and you get paperwork from the other departments automatically, where they will follow up with you saying, hey, you've registered. This is something you need to do with us now. We've seen that with the Department of Labor and Industries to make sure that we didn't have employees for the nonprofits in Washington, for instance, where they were very proactive to come back to us and say, hey, you've got this number. This is attached. Make sure you don't have any issues with us. For non-Washington entities, there is a simple foreign nonprofit registration statement. It's similar to the articles. There are a few differences. It has a more generic nature of business section to note the nonprofit's purpose and has some questions as to the nature of the reporting that you do in terms of like your accounting and stuff like that.
Jump in here. I want to mention a couple of things. We have very robust show notes this week, so listeners may want to check those out. And as I was looking through those, I noticed the Washington Secretary of State website has a really nice handbook for those new to nonprofits that are starting their first nonprofit corporation as a Washington state nonprofit. And like I said, we have a link to that in the show notes. And even if you're not involved in Washington, if you are new to nonprofits, take a look at that handbook. It's really good. You know, ignore the unique Washington state parts of it, but it really does cover all the steps to setting up a new charitable entity for success. So I just wanted to throw that in there because it's just really a very cool handbook.
No, it is. It would be nice to have every state have something similar to this.
Yeah, it's very user-friendly and very thorough. So touching on some of the more mundane aspects of the Washington state filings, is it an expensive state to file in? And what's the response time for filings?
The cost is pretty reasonable. So we're going to talk a little bit about something different here too. The filing fee for a domestic articles for a nonprofit that anticipates a gross of less than $500,000 will be $40, but it will be $80 for those above that $500,000 threshold. You know, this sounds unusual. You know, you're just starting up and you've got your gross revenue and what are you thinking about it? Realistically, what this should be is like a good faith estimate, which as a charity, when we're setting up, when you've done your IRS 1023, you usually set up a budget and an anticipation of grants and or endowments at that point. So that's where you would use as the basis here. And again, use a good faith. If you think you're going to be close to the $500K, pay the extra $40, do the $80 just to be on the safe side. And as we talk about the annual filings where you do that, then you will show that and you can pay the lower fee going forward. So like I said, that would be a good faith estimate to me. For a foreign registration, it doesn't tie to these gross revenues for the initial filing. It's just a $30 flat fee.
Okay. And so what's their response time for the filings? Is Washington quick?
It seems to be there. They note their normal online processing time as 2 business days. And then if you mail it or you do it over the counter, the current here in June of 2023 is noted as in the order received. Note that the foreign registration cannot at current be done online. The state, we looked at some stuff last year. They had some issues with their online system, and they've got it largely up to speed in terms of domestics and annual report filings, but there's still a foreign registration needs to be done over the counter right now. With that, you can always expedite the filing on the needs, as we always talk about, if you need to have your bank account open right away. And the expedite is only $50, and they note that their response is 2 to 3 business days for both a regular online right now and for a mailed over the counter if you use the expedite. So It's not too bad. We did file a registration on an expedite early May, about a month ago, and we had it back in 3 business days. We did it like on a Thursday and I had it on a Tuesday. So I think that what they're projecting on the website right now in June is what we're seeing in real time as well, which is kind of nice too.
How much personal information has to be included in the Washington filing? Are there privacy concerns that some founders might be worried about?
We've talked about this with some of our other states, but in the original articles of incorporation, the initial board members will need to be identified. So we've talked about this a few times with Arizona and Nevada as well, that there's outside of California, really, where you have sort of a time break before you do it. Most states really do want you to name your board when you're registering, when you're forming. The foreign registration does not ask for the board to be named, but a governor or governors must be named. This is a very Washington peculiar thing, and you'll see it with their LLC registrations as well. Washington defines the governor as commonly a business individual who has the authority to make decisions on behalf of the business. In this instance, we would just have to name, say, the president or the CFO, depending on what made more sense for how the nonprofit is set up. But you would have to name one of those people in your initial filing.
That's a really unusual term. When I saw that for the first time, I thought that was really strange. But anyway, governor is a special word for Washington state for their foreign nonprofit filings. So tell us a little bit about the annual filings needed when you're operating in Washington state.
They have an initial report that's due within the 30 days of you forming. And as we discussed, I believe it was with Arizona, we'd like to file this simultaneously with the Secretary of State just so that we don't have any issues of like, it's a quick turnaround. It's not the 90 days like we talk about in California. It's essentially with that first filing. And then the annual report is due by what they call the expiration date. And again, here they define it as the last day of the month in which the business was formed. If we formed in June of 2023, our annual report will then be due by June 30th, 2024.
But the initial annual report is due that same month that you...
Yes, it's due within 30 days of it. So if we form today, June 7th, in theory, you have till, depending on where the weekend falls, I'm trying to think if July 7th is a Sunday, but off the top of my head, yes, it would be July 7th to July 9th. Your first one would be due, yes.
Yeah, so that's a good idea. If you know the information that's going to be on that first initial report, you might as well be efficient with your time and file it at the same time or shortly after you file the articles. Okay, so that's the initial report and the annual report. And annual fees, we alluded to this a minute ago, that the annual fees are based on this same $500,000 threshold.
Yes, that is correct. And so it's $60 for your annual report if you're over the $500,000 threshold and $20 annually if you are under that. It's the same thing. It's about a $40 difference each time. So again, and by this time you will be filing your 990 and you'll have a very specific, easy number to attach to that to make sure you're under it.
You should have by that.
You should
by the end of that first year. You'll have a pretty good handle on how much revenue you had. Any other state agencies that a nonprofit operating in Washington needs to file with?
In Washington, the nonprofit will need a business license, which can be applied for through the State of Washington Business License Service website. With that, you'll need the UBI number we discussed and your EIN. And then if your nonprofit is going to solicit charitable donations, it will need to register as a Washington charity within the Secretary of State's Charities Program. And that also needs to be renewed annually as well, whatever you do in the charities program. And much like any other states, like here in California with our Office of Attorney General, the numbers are going to be based on your profits, or not your profits, on your donations as well and your revenue.
A lot of detail for Washington's requirements is in the show notes, so look there for more. Shifting focus, let's talk about Oregon for a little bit. Our usual questions. Why would we want to form a corporation and our nonprofit in Oregon? And if we were in another state, anything unusual about the registration, the Secretary of State registrations for foreign charities in Oregon?
No, not really. I mean, we're talking about if you have a business presence there. We have one that we just had because the primary donors that set up the foundation as a family foundation live in Oregon. So we formed it in Delaware and then registered it in Oregon because that's where the primary donations are going to be coming from. So that's a simple way to understand here what it means to have business in Oregon. And then for the filing there, they also have a form articles of incorporation, and more like our California one, it's not very robust, but it does allow for an attachment for any provisions you would like to add to the form. And it has specific checkbox for the type of nonprofit, which is unusual. So you've got public benefit, mutual benefit, or religious. Even more unusual, it has a checkbox option to note whether you are indemnifying directors, officers, employees, and agents under Oregon statutes. So it behooves you to think about what that means and who you're going to have in Oregon if you are actually forming the company there. For foreign nonprofits, there's an application for authority to transact business that is basically identical to the articles, although it does not have that indemnification proviso. So that's something that's specific to being formed in the state, not registering as a foreign in the state. So again, that may be something, if you're thinking of doing business in Oregon, of thinking about going to Delaware and then registering in Oregon and weighing what that indemnification obligation may or may not leave you open to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is an interesting feature of the Oregon nonprofit statute. And I should mention that for all of these other states, if there are legal questions or if there are questions that seem to have a really important impact for the particular nonprofit, consult with local legal counsel because some of these distinctions may be really important for your organization. Ticking back through the rest of our checklist here, cost and timing for filing in Oregon, how does it look there?
So both the domestic Oregon and the foreign registration are $50. We didn't talk about it with Washington, but as always, remember that any service fees associated with your registered agent that you choose should be factored into that as you do that as well. Unlike Washington, where we talked about your agent does not need to sign the document here. So this is just a straight file through with that. And at current, as of June 1st, Oregon response time is noted as 1 business day for e-filings, same day for over-the-counter if in before 4 p.m. their time, and 5 to 7 business days if you mail or fax the filings. And they don't have an expedite available. It may be a product simply of the state not having per se a lot of filings per se. It's not a sexy state like California or Washington, but it has this, it's so they may not have as big a business going through it, so they don't have to worry about an expedite and they have that shorter time frame.
How much information about the individual founders involved do we have to include in the filing for Oregon? Whose name is going to show up on these initial filings?
We don't have to name the entire board here, but for a domestic, you need to name the initial president and the initial secretary. And for the foreign registration, then you have to name the current president and the current secretary. So
just 1 or 2 names, but not the whole board.
1 or 2 names, depending on how you've set that up, yes.
Annual filings and fees.
Like our discussion of Arizona last month, in Oregon, the annual report is due exactly on the date of formation annually. So if we form today, June 7th, 2023, my next report will be due June 1st, 2024, and every year thereafter. So it makes it both easier and less easier because it's not a beginning of the month, end of the month date. And that statement of information will be $50. If we file today, June 7th, 2023, then June 7th, 2024 will be my first annual report.
Got it. All right. So other state agencies in Oregon, do they have other registries that our nonprofit needs to check in with?
So if the corporation is organized in Oregon specifically as a public benefit nonprofit or a foreign corporation which solicits, holds assets, or does business in Oregon, it must register with the Oregon Department of Justice and file an annual report with them. Again, this is similar to what we see in California with our Office of the Attorney General.
Okay. A lot of these Oregon details are also in the show notes. And with that, I think we'll wrap up our quick tip for this week. And this has been really interesting. These 2 states have some minor unique features for those of us who are really focused on detail for domestic nonprofit corporations. Thanks for talking through this with me, Joe. I really appreciate it.
And thanks. I'm glad I could be on this week.
Yeah. It's a slightly glitchy one this week, but the listeners, I think, are bearing with us, and hopefully you all got something good out of this episode. Be sure to check out the show notes. They're more coherent than our conversation today. We've got some great links to resources in Washington and Oregon. And go back to episodes 38 and 40 if you want to understand what we were talking about for California, Delaware, Nevada, and Arizona state filings. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun, and Martell. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.